We have panelists from Canada, US, UK, Turkey, Pakistan, Iceland, and many other places who will join us later. Today we will be discussing the UPR 41 of India. As you know, the Universal Periodic Review 41 session is on in Geneva. It starts on 7th of November and will continue till 18th. And India will be reviewed on 10th. That's tomorrow. Indian human rights record will come under scrutiny tomorrow at the UN. What the information we so far have and what we have seen in the UPR processes in the last 3 UPR processes, we can show you that how India behaved in those processes. In last UPR 3, the government of India was handed over 242 recommendations by the different stakeholders and also the member states. Government of India accepted 152 recommendations and noted others. But unfortunately, what we see till date, none of those recommendations which were accepted, they were fully implemented. Instead, India introduced new set of laws in order to create more problems for the people in the India and the territories which India occupies, especially that of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The current, what we see, the recommendations which have been put forth by the stakeholders and the questions put forth by different by different states, member states to the government of India are alarming. That I can see what I counted for the stakeholders report. The government, the stakeholders, that's different NGOs from across the globe have put forth nearly more than 200 recommendations to the government of India. And most of the recommendations do concern the scope of international obligation and cooperation with the human rights mechanisms and also the constitutional and legal framework in India. And also promotion and protection of human rights and institutional infrastructure and policy measures that Indian government has to take. When we see that all in the 3 UPR cycles, the government of India was asked to repeal or to ratify the Convention Against Torture. And again, it has come to the notes that the government of India did nothing on this. And again, the stakeholders as well as the member states have called on government of India to ratify the Convention Against Torture, ratify the Convention Against the Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, and also stop criminalizing the freedom of speech in India, as we have seen that the government of India has not yet ratified the freedom of association and protection of the rights of the organized conventions of 1948, number 87, and right to organize and collective bargaining convention 1949, number 98 of the ILO. And government of India was also asked to ratify the convention, the optional protocols of the Convention of Civil and Political Rights. When it comes to the territory which we belong, especially we talk about that's of the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Government of India was time and again asked to repeal the Armed Forces Special Power Act, Public Safety Act, National Security Act, and other draconian laws which facilitate the human rights violations in that territory. And also, we also, the KR Kashmir Institute of International Relations also submitted its parallel report to the 4th cycle of UPR, whereby we also had certain recommendations for the government of India, which are the part of the stakeholders summary compiled by the UN. So again, in this one, we see that scope for international obligation and cooperation with the human rights mechanisms, national human rights framework, constitutional and legislative framework, institutional infrastructure and policy measures, and promotion and protection of human rights, that implementation of additional human rights obligations, taking into account the applicability of international human rights law. So what we, why we are discussing this today, because tomorrow India will be reviewed. And we hope that the Troika, which is Nepal, Sudan, and Netherlands, and the working group, that's the member states of the Human Rights Council, will come with strong questions to Government of India and strong recommendations. And we can see these recommendations will be more and more to the Government of India. But the way Government of India has conducted so far, I could remember that during the third cycle of UPR, it was Indian Solicitor General who told the Human Rights Council that we don't need any external advices. Again and again, India says it has its own constitutional framework to deal with the human rights and other obligations, but they don't take into account any of the international obligations, and they say we don't seek any external advice. So it is for the Human Rights Council to decide how to deal with such an arrogant attitude of Government of India, whereby she is not willing to cooperate with the UN human rights systems. And being a member of the Council, India has an obligation to do it. So we could see from last 4.5 years, India introduced the National Registration Act and other acts in order to criminalize the very existence of the minorities, religious minorities, and other ethical groups in India. So we will discuss in this. I'll straight away go to Robert Vitana because he has joined us from Toronto. Robert, you have the floor to deal with the situation. Robert, floor is yours.
Thank you. Today, it is a privilege to be here with so many distinguished speakers and experts. The ongoing oppression of the people of Kashmir by the Indian government continues to worsen and is generally ignored by the international community. The recent Universal Periodic Review discusses not only those atrocities, but the many violations of human rights and international law that are being perpetrated by and within India. Today, I will focus on a few of the recommendations made by the Universal Periodic Review in 2017, but have still not been implemented by India. The first one is this: ensure that laws are fully and consistently enforced to provide adequate protections for members of religious minorities, scheduled castes, tribes, and other vulnerable populations, close quote. In many areas in India, it isn't safe for Muslims to walk the streets. A recent report from the Council on Foreign Relations said the following, quote, experts say anti-Muslim sentiments have heightened under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, which has pursued a Hindu nationalist agenda since elected to power in 2014. Since Modi's re-election in 2019, the government has pushed controversial policies that critics say explicitly ignore Muslims' rights and are intended to disenfranchise millions of Muslims. Under Modi, violence against Muslims has become more common, close quote. Please note that the recommendation from 2017 to ensure that religious minorities are protected predates Modi's re-election, after which conditions worsened. This demonstrates that the Modi government's contempt for the opinion of the international community is very clear. The next recommendation I will comment on is as follows, quote, in the spirit of its constitution, which guarantees rights to all minorities, further invest in dedicated human rights training of police officials to register and investigate cases of discrimination and violence and to hold them accountable when they fail to do so, close quote. A report from Human Rights Watch of last month says the following, quote, the authorities in several Indian states are carrying out violence against Muslims as a kind of summary punishment. Officials blatantly disregard the rule of law and are sending a message to the public that Muslims can be discriminated against and attacked, close quote. The report describes specific incidents, including the public flogging of Muslim men by police, to the victims allegedly threw stones at a Hindu festival. There was no due process. The men weren't arrested, given the opportunity for legal defense, tried, convicted, and sentenced. No, the police simply flogged them while others held the victims down. Pro-government television networks showed videos that included Hindus cheering and applauding the brutal assault, and television commentators praised this brutality. Clashes in various neighborhoods between Hindus and Muslims routinely caused the police to demolish Muslim-owned properties. This is seen as collective punishment, a concept that violates international law. The Human Rights Report also said that Indian police used excessive force against protesters and demolished the homes of Muslims who they suspect of being conspirators, behind any violence that may erupt during protests. Another recommendation from 2017 that still has not been implemented reads in part as follows: prevent and pursue through the appropriate judicial means all violent acts against religious and tribal minorities, close quote. In 1990, India implemented what is called an emergency law in Jammu and Kashmir, known as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. This act gives the military supreme control over the region. It enables arbitrary arrests and detention, provides no consequence to soldiers or the police, rapes and disappearances, and allows extrajudicial executions. The impunity of the Indian forces for crimes committed against the people of Jammu and Kashmir is complete. These crimes, needless to say, are violations of international law. Some are considered crimes against humanity. On November 5th of this year, the Daily Times reported the following: the Modi-led BJP government has also imposed a lockdown in occupied Kashmir, allowing Indian forces to perpetrate unspeakable crimes against the masses with complete impunity, close quote. Why have these and so many other recommendations made by the international community been completely ignored? Why, instead of addressing to any extent these appalling violations of human rights and international law, has the government of India only worsened conditions in that country? The foundation can be fed in Hindutva. In Counter-Terrorist Transit Analysis in June of 2020, Sudha Ramachandran summarizes Hindutva. And please excuse me if I mispronounce these names. Quote, Hindutva, the modern political ideology, views India as a Hindu nation and defines Indian culture in terms of Hindu cultural values. Its goal is to make India a Hindu state. In his 1923 treatise, Hindutva ideologue Vinayak Damodar Savarkar said that Hindus are the only true Indians, as their fatherland and holy land are in India. Muslims and Christians, however, could not be considered India, as their holy lands were not in India but in far-off Arabia or Palestine. Savarkar's ideological successor, Madhva Sadajiv Golwalkar, who was one of the founders of the RSS, an extreme right-wing paramilitary organization, said that the foreign races, that is, Muslims and Christians in India, must either adapt the Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold and reverence Hindu religion, lose their separate existence to merge in the Hindu race, stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights, close quote. So the goal is to make India a Hindu state. We see a strong parallel between what is happening in India and what is happening in Israel. In 2018, Israel passed the so-called nation-state law, which declares Israel as the home of the Jewish people. In 2019, Israeli actress Stella made an Instagram post criticizing the Israel culture minister, who said that if a certain candidate were elected, he would create a government that would include Arabs. Ms. Stella commented this, quote, "What's the problem with Arabs? Dear God, there are also Arab citizens in this country. When will anyone in this government tell us that it is the country of all its citizens and all people born equal?" Close quote. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has just been re-elected, as you know, decided to weigh in with a Facebook post. Addressing his comments to Ms. Stella, he said this: "First of all, an important correction. Israel is not a country of all its citizens. According to the nation-state law that we passed, Israel is a nation of the Jewish. It's the nation-state of the Jewish nation, and it's alone." Close quote. It should not be a surprise that India is using the same repressive tactics against Muslims in India and Kashmir as Israel is using against Arabs, Muslim and Christian, in Israel and Palestine. On November 16, 2019, Pandit Chakravarti, India's Consul General to New York City, was in New York attending a private event. He told Kashmiri Hindus and Indian nationalists that India will build settlements modeled after Israel for the return of the Hindu population to Kashmir. He did not mince words. He said, "I believe the security situation will improve. It will allow refugees to go back. In your lifetime, you will be able to go back and you'll be able to find security because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. If Israeli people can do it, we can also do it." Close quote. The so-called security situation may improve for Indians to live in Kashmir, which is deadly for the Kashmiris. Why does the international community not act? Why do these horrific crimes against Muslims continue? There are more than 200 million Muslims living in Canada. Why does the world look away when they're being so brutally persecuted? There are possibly a few reasons. First, and perhaps foremost, India's economy is strengthening, and with a population over 1 billion, it is a rich source for other countries to export products to and reap the financial benefits of doing so. For most governments, profits trump human rights and economy. Secondly, Modi may have been empowered by the fawning adoration of former US President Donald Trump. Trump visited India and met with Modi in early 2020 and praised him at a rally in February of that year. He said this, quote, "America loves India. America respects India, and America will always be faithful and loyal friend to the Indian people. India will always hold a very special place in our hearts," close quote. He called Modi a man I am proud to call my true friend. Not much changed with the change of US president. In May of this year, the White House statement described a meeting between Modi and President Joe Biden. One stunning sentence is worth reading, quote, "President Biden and Prime Minister Modi renewed their commitment to a bilateral relationship rooted in a shared tradition of democracy, freedom, tolerance, and equality, and equal opportunity for all citizens," close quote. The 665-word statement included no criticism of the repressive Indian government. 200 million people in India are at constant risk of the deadly, brutal whims of the government, military, and police. The international community has shown that it simply doesn't care. That is why it is of vital importance to mobilize the people throughout the world, those who care more for human rights than for profits and power, to work to assure that their governments take a strong and principled stand for the suffering people of India and Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for your wonderful intervention. I will straight away go to Brother Gurpreet Singh Johal, who is a solicitor and a notary public, as brother of Jagtar Singh Johal, who is incarcerated in India. He is also leading the Free Jagtar Singh campaign. Mr. Gurpreet, you have the floor.
Thank you, Altaf. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're based. It's a privilege to be able to speak with such extreme panelists today. It's really an important issue that we're discussing in respect of the human rights violations that have been taking place against minorities throughout India and for a number of years. For myself, personally, things got worse. November 2017, 4th of November, my family is feeling the human rights violations that have been taking place of a British national, Jagtar Singh Johal, who travelled to India to get married. 2 weeks after his marriage, he was out shopping with his wife and the car was intercepted. He was hooded and bungled into a van, kept in commando for 10 days, so the world did not know where he was, whilst the British government were trying to find out where he was located. During the first 4 days of his detention, he was brutally tortured, third-degree torture to the extent of having electrocution to his private parts, to his sensitive parts, and being told that he would be killed or burnt alive. The main reason of this was Jagtar Singh Johal was somebody that was documenting about the human rights violations that took place in 1984 onwards. Going forward from this, the Chief Minister on the 7th of November 2017 stated that they had solved these crimes against RSS Hindu leaders, and Jagtar again was implicated by a trial by media. So this, in a nutshell, is he was subject to torture, which goes against prevention of torture and mistreatment. A trial by media was started by the Chief Minister, which you had the DGP of Punjab Police saying that we have all of this evidence. And a lot has happened over the last 5 years, but to put it in a context, Jagtar has still not been formally charged in all of the allegations that have been made against him. But the crux of it is the UAPA. So one of the recommendations is the draconian laws of the UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Previously, we had, as a youth, I had heard about TADA, the extreme measures that it had, but UAPA is worse. Jactor has been remanded, more or less, under trial for the last 5 years without bail. Each time any application is made for bail, the judges or the prosecution will argue that this is a matter of state, there's terrorism involved, and as a result, the judges will refuse bail and Jactor remains in incarceration. What's been different for myself here is Jactor is a British born and bred national. And this is what's happening to somebody that's a foreign national within India. What happens to Indian nationals within India itself, minorities? Under UAPA, I believe that 98% of the cases that are registered are against minorities, mostly Muslims or Sikhs. Their conviction rate is less than 2%. And even those that are convicted on UAPA turn around on appeal, they are found, either on appeal, their decision is overturned, or when it goes to trial, eventually after so many years, they're found not guilty. That's the extent of the draconian laws that are taking place. So when I seen the recommendations that we put forward, no person should be subject to torture and mistreatment. No person, whether guilty or not guilty, has to go through that process. And it's unfair and unjust in respect of it. So that's a highly recommended aspect of it. I never expected a British national to be tortured. So, and the reason I touch upon this is what extent of the torture takes place against minorities, because it seems to be the first thing that the police will do is beat up a person when they do their investigations. And that is why the Indian state are not ratifying the anti-torture laws, because they know if they do that, they'll be subject to a lot of incidents or legal actions against them. Secondly would be the UAPA. It's unjust, it's unfair. Families are affected as a result, and mostly they're affected under UAPA because India claim that it's a terror against the country, whereas there's no evidence in respect of keeping people detained for so long and then messing up their lives. So I welcome the recommendations that have came in respect of the anti-torture, in respect of UAPA. The legal system within India itself needs a shake-up, where cases are not going forward as they should be going forward. I found personally that India don't even listen to the UN, because we recently had the working group on arbitrary detention declare Jactor's detention arbitrary and he should be released immediately. It's taken a while because the bodies in the UN itself have been something that's been slow process, but eventually when it does, we find that the Indian, like Robert said earlier and Altaf said earlier, was that the Indian state, we have our own mechanisms in order to deal with these things. And as a result, they don't want third-party interventions in respect of this. So I think together we can help and make change. What we have found from Jactor's case is we've managed to highlight the human rights violations on a worldwide level in respect of what's been going on for the last 35 years in respect to Sikhs itself. So we've been able to document and show what happens, these injustices. And for me as a solicitor within the UK, the extent of the amount of people that are held in jails because they don't have legal representation and they don't want to put burdens on their family. This is a system that India is using to cause more human rights violations. So together we can work and we can call these atrocities out. I think that's the only way this is actually going to help minorities within India itself, because the current regime is not going to allow people to speak. And if they do speak, we see what happens. They're put under UAPA and put into jails in respect of that. But at the same time, whilst we're talking about India, we need to talk about other countries, because other countries seem to be friendly with India and putting trade, and UK included. So I think it's important that we use each country and we raise as much awareness of what's going on. So that was my input in respect of this. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to share a personal experience that we've had under the Indian system, the anti-torture, in terms of the UAPA and the legal system itself. And the final point I would say is India does have the National Human Rights, NHRC, but we have found them to be toothless. They don't seem to have any powers at all. They don't seem to be able to do anything at all. And quite often we're told to go and contact the NHRC in India, but it doesn't go anywhere. So like I said, I'm grateful for the time. To put on record my feelings against how the state is, and that's not just against my own family, but against minorities itself, because we've seen a lot of things that have happened over the last 5 years. And together, I think there is change coming. It's slow, but there is change coming. So we'll continue to work together. So that's my part. Altaf, thank you. And thank you for the panel for listening.
Thank you, Gurpreet, for your intervention. You rightly brought in the case of your brother, how he was incarcerated and tortured and detained under UAPA. We have seen, because he was documenting the atrocities which India has done during 1984 massacre of Sikhs in Punjab. Similarly, we see the human rights defenders of Kashmir, the noted human rights defender, world-known human rights defender, Khurram Parvez facing the same charges, also known to facing the same charges, and our journalists like Sajjad Gul, Fahad Shah, and others, Asif Sultan and others, they're all facing the same charges because of reporting the facts on the ground. So this is how India is doing. And you rightly pointed out that Indian Human Rights Commission is toothless. I went through the recommendations, the report of the Indian National Human Rights Commission. They have not dealt on any of the issues of concern by the civil society around the globe and the UN human rights mechanisms. Now I will go to Mariana Zacca. Mariana is a friend and a human rights defender from Italy, as she has to go to join the job. So I'll straight away go to Mariana. Mariana, your intervention, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Hello, good morning, good evening. Hello, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Wani, for inviting me. I am really glad to join this panel today. And I would like to talk about the situation of Jammu and Kashmir. As Mr. Wani has said, I am a long-time friend of Jammu and Kashmir, and I have been studying the situation of Jammu and Kashmir for since many years. And today we have the chance to talk about a very important topic, that of UPR, which is addressed to the Indian government. The UPR, as my colleagues have already said, is a central system for the UN evaluation of the members states' human rights record, and the goal is that of improve the human rights situation within every single state. How are we going to evaluate, and how is UN going to evaluate the human rights record by the Indian government? They are taking into account the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, treaties ratified by the Indian government and international humanitarian law. And I also would like to address that they are going to evaluate the Indian performance also under the light of the so-called jus cogens, which is part of the international law. As Mr. Wani has already said, I am a long-time friend and I have been studying and documenting myself for a long time. And this time I have taken into account the publication made by the Arit Academy from Geneva, which largely describe the Indian violations and atrocities committed within the territories of Jammu and Kashmir. First of all, I would like to remind all of you that the first time that India has been studied by under the light of UPR has been in 2017, so 5 years ago. This is going to be the so-called follow-up of UPR, and it will take into consideration what has happened throughout all this year. I do remember that in 2019, in the early days of August 2019, India imposed a general lockdown in the Kashmiri territories. And I do remember that we have talked about this issue for a long time within the UN system and the UN Human Rights Council as with the side events, and asking to India to answer to the questions that human rights activists and people from Jammu and Kashmir had. What has happened in 2019? As you have already said, the Indian government decided to remove and repeal the Article 317 and Article 35A from the Indian Constitution, which both recognize a high degree of autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir region. Why this? As you have already analyzed, this decision has been taken for a political goal, but also it was due for a demographic change within the region, because as we already know, Kashmir is the region that has a higher presence of Muslim people, and we know that instead India is not a Muslim state. So what has happened is that within the Kashmir and Jammu territories, we turned to have a background of an armed conflict, a civilian armed conflict, and people faced a lockdown based on the cut of internet, restriction of connection, not only within the territories, but also with the foreign, with people that were living abroad. And so Kashmiri people were not allowed to have any kind of connection, or they were not able to get in touch to other persons, and also to they have also seen other kind of human rights restricted. And I am going to talk it really briefly because I just want to talk for a few minutes. People from Kashmir have seen the freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of peacefully assembly and union restricted. But they have also seen other kind of human rights restrictions and violations. And I would just like to remind you that the framework of this Kashmiri lockdown was a background of a civil conflict and an armed conflict in which rape and gender-based violence turned into a tool of war. So already in 2017, the UN asked to the government of India to restore the internet connection and the living conditions within Jammu and Kashmir. What has happened, as we have already seen and explained, is that the situation got worse and worse, so that in Kashmir, since the 5th of August 2019 to the 5th of February 2021, people suffered from a strong lockdown, and I would like to underline unlawful lockdown for 1 year and 6 months. Given that we are addressing our request to the government of India, the first recommendation is to restore. We would kindly urge to restore as soon as possible the living conditions in Jammu and Kashmir on behalf of the dignity of each single person living within the territories. Then we kindly recommend to the Indian government to ensure an independent, impartial, and credible commission on investigation on the crimes committed by the Indian forces, mostly because the Indian armed forces is guilty to have used women's body as a tool of war. And I would like to see this, I would like to see justice for Kashmiri women. Also because India has ratified the CEDAW in the 90s, and the accession to the treaty, to this international treaty, has been in 1993. And furthermore, lastly but not least, I would kindly recommend the Indian government to improve the rights embodied in the international, in the ICCPR and the International Covenant on Social, Economic and Political Rights. Lastly but not least, I would like to recommend the Indian government to do what has not been done, but has been requested by the international community to the Indian government throughout all those years. So to collaborate and work with the UN system, collaborate with the UN experts that are asking for the full respect of the human rights within the Kashmiri territories since 2017. I am asking all of this on behalf, as I have already said, to the dignity and respect of freedom and human rights of people from Jammu and Kashmir. Thanks everybody, and I have been really, really glad to join you today.
Thank you, Mariana Zaga, for your intervention. Before I go to my next speaker, who is Professor Dr. Imtiaz Khan, who's professor at George Washington University at Washington. Professor Khan is also a Kashmiri, and he has a long association in working on Kashmir, and he has currently been to the Kashmir, and we will have the first-hand information from him. Before that, I would like to thank Lexington, Germany, UK, USA, Panama, Belgium, Slovenia, Canada, Portugal, and others who have submitted the advanced questions to the government of India with regards to this current UPR process. Dr. Khan, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wani Saab, and it's a pleasure to speak with the very well-renowned people about Kashmir and other human rights violations inflicted upon the people, whether it is Muslims in Kashmir or Sikhs in Punjab. I am a Kashmiri and I visited Kashmir a few months ago. The question which we have to take into consideration that Modi government undoubtedly has unleashed a reign of terror against minorities, especially on people of Kashmir. But human rights violations were there since 1990 when movement for the liberation of Kashmir started, where Kashmiri people demanded that UN resolutions should be implemented. You have to remember, till 2019, when current government came into power, 100,000 people were massacred. thousands of women were raped. There were mass graves found, discovered by Professor Angana Chatterjee when she visited Kashmir, and she collaborated with the local lawyer. And when the Indian government got whiff of it, they were booted out of the country.
Yes,
The question is, what happened pre-2019 and what is happening post-2019? Pre-2019, the policy of the government was to terrorize the people of Kashmir, kill them rampantly, and basically take them into the army camps, kill them and hand over the bodies next day to their kids and kins. There's an example of Kunan Poshpora where about 80 women ranging from the age of 10 to 80 was raped throughout the night when their men were camped outside. It was done by Rashtriya Rifles. What is happening after 2019 is that this government introduced a policy where they said they will change the demographic character of Kashmir so that tomorrow, when the plebiscite is held, there will be a Hindu majority and they will have the vote to their liking. I have been visiting Kashmir since I have been in the United States because I have a family there every year. In 2019, I couldn't visit, and in 2020, there was COVID. Then last year, I visited Kashmir, and what I found when I landed on the airport, I was really confused. Hey, is this my birthplace, the place where I have been raised, place where I got my education, or I have landed on a holy Hindu city? Because airport was full of people with vermilion on their head. These were Hindu pilgrims. What they are doing in Kashmir is basically they are creating a sites and linking some to Hindu religion so that people can visit all over, and these visits are subsidized by the governments. And plan is to have a permanent abordments for these Hindu people who are well armed, so that tomorrow they can terrorize the local population. If you go to Kashmir right now, all the high-level officers are from India. Basically, they are giving the state subject, making them the permanent residents. They have to hundreds of thousands of people. It is being done in a planned manner. And it is believed, not by me, but some of my eco-activists who have visited Kashmir, that within next 2-3 years, all the demographic character will be totally changed in Kashmir. They basically, the army, with impunity, they will go to the houses. They first plunder them. Then they basically blow up the whole locality. In 2019, when this 35A and 370 was abolished, about 10 to 15,000 youth were incarcerated. And they are still languishing in different jails of India with no legal recourse. Even when there's a war, the dead body is handed towards the kith. The tallest leader of Kashmir, Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani, his body was impounded, and against the wishes of his family, it was buried by the army. The family was not allowed to attend the funeral. As Mr. Wani just said, we have Khurram Parvez, who is not affiliated to any political party. He's a human rights activist. He has published an exhaustive report of 900 pages about quoting each and every violation, human rights abuses. And under some flimsy reason, he is being incarcerated in Tihar jail. We have Yasin Malik, who has been given a life sentence, and he's in a poor health. The plan is so that to kill him in the jail. He entered into negotiations with the former Indian Prime Minister. He has visited State Department, and he started the movement of non-violence signature campaign and a Gandhian approach to this Kashmir problem. The idea is to decapitate the leadership of Kashmir, to create an atmosphere of terror, and to subject people to the ghettos so that they cannot raise their voices, and have these Hindu capitalists from rest of India take over the hotels, take over all the business establishments, and treat Kashmiris like a third-class citizens. And this plan is being implemented in letter and spirit. This is what are they doing in Kashmir. And rest of India, my earlier speakers have mentioned to that it is not the police, the law enforcement agencies who are terrorizing. There are vigilante groups getting protection from the BJP government. If there's a slight suspect, they can just accuse me that you were eating beef or carrying beef and just basically lynch me in public. The problem is India had never been held accountable by the world community. Imagine 1984, when Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Thousands of Sikhs were burnt alive. Was India made answerable for this? Who committed those crimes? These were government-sponsored agencies. The world community has not basically responded to human rights abuse, as was said earlier. United Nations is an irrelevant body, a toothless tiger. I personally have gone to UN office so umpteen times, giving them report after report. What they do is that they write a letter, India says, we cannot allow you to visit it, and that is the end. United Nations is nothing but United States. Whatever United States want to get done, they get it done. But for other issues, United Nations is an irrelevant body. You can write these reports and recommendations and so on and so forth. But we have to say, be serious. Will anything can be done? Does any of the panelists believe that these recommendations India will even read them? The question is, unless India is held accountable, it is just like, for example, if I want to steal somebody's property or somebody's money, I will not do it because there will be a legal recourse. With India, everybody is doing business, everything is hunky-dory, and they said clearly that Kashmir issue is, we have resolved it. So I am not an expert on human rights or what is happening in Geneva and what kind of resolutions they are passing and what kind of recommendations they are giving. But to me, to be very blunt, and my apologies for that, it is a futile exercise. Unless there are consequences to the Indian decisions. That if you continue with these human rights violations in an unabated manner, their world body will react. You have India, Pakistan, a nuclear power, a somewhat unstable state. Any time a minor misunderstanding can result in nuclear conflagration, and that can be catastrophic to the half of the world population. The world is sitting on a power keg, and India's arrogance and demon-like attitude is being tolerated. And this will be the biggest blunder. That has to be explained to the world. Because India is basically, thumping nose on the world. Because they know that they are they can go away with anything. They can eliminate as many Muslims, as many Sikhs. They can pass laws and others. And all international community will do, write a letter of condemnation. I remember in 2019, my own senator, Senator Chris O'Wallen, he went to Delhi and he wanted to visit Kashmir and they didn't allow him. And world has tolerated it. So as a Kashmiri who has a family there and talk to him, these resolutions don't mean anything unless and until there is certain practical decision, whether it is Organization of Islamic Countries or it is United Nations. The question is what we have to ask ourselves is that if Khurram Parvez and human rights activists has been incarcerated, why is the world community informed about that? Now we were telling that we should go to the peace-loving people of the world and tell them what we have to hold seminars, we have to go to universities. There should be demonstrations on the streets of London, in New York, in Geneva, and so on and so forth, urging their governments to take action, to respond to it. Not Yasin Malik, why can't we have a campaigns? Unless we launch these effective campaigns, this issue cannot be solved in closed rooms by a handful of people. There should be a well to tell the world when he talks about India, talks about Gandhism, non-violence, democracy, and tell them it is all farce, it is a ruse. And that is the reality. The picture of India has not been presented to the world. So I know there are a long list of speakers, I can go on and on, but I will put an end. I will close that. We respect these human rights organizations who are recommending and basically telling India, but I'm sorry to say I found that they will be highly ineffective. And one of the speakers, and I think a couple of them said about the human rights institutions in India and everything. Let me tell you, in India, all institutions are defunct. They don't function. Courts don't function. There's a case of Afzal Guru who was hanged about 7-8 years ago, and Chief Justice of India said, though there is not overwhelming evidence implicating him in this action, but the will of the people have to rest because people want him to be hanged. So I will pass the sentence. That's what Indian courts about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Imtiaz Khan. As a Kashmiri who has been there and who has been witnessing all this, you spoke from the core of your heart. The recourses which are available, we have to take all those recourses. And one of the recourses is to make the government of India and also the international community aware of this. We talked about Khurram Parvez. I can see that all the human rights special rapporteurs wrote to the government of India. They start a campaign against it. But at the end of the day, they can only recommend, they can say that because the international human rights system has been devised in such a way because it has no teeth to bite. So we have to find the teeth to bite, how we can make that possible. I have another friend from US, Mary Seculi, very vocal voice. Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you. After reading this report from the United Nations Human Rights Council, I think it's hard to understand how India can be considered either democratic or secular. It was a comprehensive and extremely damning report. I did have a major problem with the report, and that is that it treats the violence in Kashmir as of a piece with the violence in India, violence of all kind. And I think that the occupation of Kashmir and the colonial genocide being conducted there changes the character of violence in Kashmir from what it is in India. The United Nations has a resolution which recognizes the self-determination of Kashmiris. And India systematically is violating that. And it makes the character of violence in Kashmir something quite different. It gives it a genocidal and mass character in Kashmir, which it does not have to the same degree in the rest of India, no matter how egregious and pervasive the violence is. When you have 900,000 troops, and that is almost the size of the Russian army, or almost the size of the American army, when you have that many troops stationed in a very small country like Kashmir, with these guns, with checkpoints and guns directed at unarmed Kashmiris, it changes the character of violence. The report deals with aspects of that occupation as if they were manifestations of human rights crimes, the same as in India. But as I said, they take on a genocidal mass character in Kashmir. One example would be the violence against women. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a child abduction alert. One example would be the character of violence against women in Kashmir compared to that in India. It's not to make violence against Dalits or the indigenous women and girls or others less odious and less criminal. But the character of violence in Kashmir is a weapon of war. It takes on a mass character, as the man before me pointed out, Kunin and Pashpura. They raped and they tortured all of the men in 2 villages, and they raped all of the women and girls of all ages. So it takes on a very different character when it becomes a weapon of war, and cannot be merely treated as a rape culture or as a rape culture as it is in India. So as I said, I think primarily it was the contributions of Pakistan to the report and the Kashmir Institute of International Relations that actually pointed out with some power and some cogency the instruments of occupation, like the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the Public Safety Act. And both of those organizations called for the repeal, not the amendment, but the repeal of those laws, I think quite correctly. I don't believe that the violence in Kashmir, the colonial occupation of Kashmir, is of a piece with the violence in India, except that it legitimizes and normalizes violence against people in India itself. It also, it's connected because it shows the crisis of political leadership, of the neoliberal policies of the government. It shows the crisis that they are only able to conduct an occupation to control the population of India by the use of extreme violence of all kinds. And I think it shows the crisis of political leadership, and that is a weakness of extreme importance to political activists. Unfortunately, what is also shown is the crisis of leadership in civil society organizations in India. The progressive organizations of India are massive organizations with thousands of members, and they have not organized any kind of defense campaigns, and certainly they have not are not involved in organizing an anti-colonial movement in support of the Kashmiri people. The report was quite stunning, quite striking, because it shows that the number of political prisoners in India who are human rights defenders among the Dalits and other oppressed castes, among the indigenous tribes, among women, among all sorts of constituencies. The political prisoners among human rights activists and journalists are almost as many as there are of Kashmiris. And yet these political organizations are not publicizing this, educating about it, conducting defense campaigns. And so these prisoners are left to rot and die in Indian prisons, as are the Kashmiri political prisoners. I mean, one of the most striking stories was that of the 84-year-old Jesuit priest, a human rights defender who died in prison. I believe it was, if I recall right, for lack of medical care, as many of these political prisoners. And yet these the civil society organizations are not campaigning, are not mobilizing, are not collaborating to defend any of these prisoners. And that is a weakness, a political weakness, again, of the greatest consequence. I thought that the interrogatories or recommendations by most of the individual countries were overly legalistic, if not even wimpy. And again, with the exception of the contribution by Pakistan and by the Kashmir Institute of International Relations, which were more hard-hitting and direct. I thought most of them were overly wimpy, to be honest. And I think that an explanation for that is that many of these individual countries, in particular the United States and Russia and other countries, have considerable military and economic entanglements with India, substantial vested interests, which they are not willing to jeopardize. And that, I think, tempers their criticisms of India's human rights crimes, in particular, its human rights crimes against Kashmiris. India can be called a rogue state. It has considerable entanglements with Israel. It is helping to sustain Russia in its war against Ukraine. It's sustaining Russia against sanctions, and yet it has it has this brutal occupation against Kashmir, as well as against some of the other states and some of the other peoples of India. And yet it has been, the United States has recently increased its entanglements, military and commercial, with India. India was recently re-elected again to the UN Human Rights Council for another term from 2022 to 24. And there are no sanctions. It faces no sanctions or repercussions of any kind for its violence against its own people or in occupied Kashmir. I think that what it does is point to the kinds of responsibilities that solidarity activists have towards Kashmiris and toward Indians. And one of them is, as other speakers have pointed out, is to put pressure on our own governments to begin to do the right thing towards Kashmiris and Indians, to take human rights crimes seriously and not just make periodic wimpy suggestions and recommendations to India, that they actually begin to sanction and sever their relations. And that will only come about if solidarity activists begin to organize political pressure on our own governments. I think that the report very cogently points out the issues that we need to organize around. And one of them is, of course, to demand the release of all political prisoners, immediate release of all political prisoners, both Indian political prisoners and Kashmiri political prisoners. And we have to make that a focus of our campaign. The second thing, perhaps it's the first demand, is to demand the immediate withdrawal of all unconditional withdrawal of all Indian forces from Kashmir. The immediate release, the immediate demilitarization of Kashmir, and I think considerable reparations to the people of Kashmir. They have to restore its previous rights. They have to allow the people of Kashmir to vote for what they want, to actually implement self-determination and to decide their relationship to India and Pakistan. And I think that that the human rights crimes that India is accused of committing can only be put in that context. If we are going to seriously address it. So to my mind, putting the occupation of Kashmir, the colonial occupation, first and foremost in our minds, really helps us to understand the character of human rights crimes in Kashmir as compared to the character of human rights crimes in India. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mary. You're always on spot and very wonderful recommendations. Without any further ado, I'll go to my friend, Mohammed Sukru Guzel. He's a friend of ours, a human rights defender. Professor Mohammed Sukru Guzel has been nominated for the Nobel Prize. It's very honored to listen to him. Guzel, you have the floor, please.
Dear Mr. Wani, my dear brother, many thanks, and I'm saying my dear regards to all the participants and the people who are listening to me. So sometimes it is easy to talk in the first part. When you begin to talk in the middle or at the end, all your speech can change. But let me tell you the thing. When we are talking about universal periodic review, in fact, we are talking about the concept of the realization of the self-determination, which is an internal self-determination, subject to Article 3 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And this is the mistake on Kashmir issue, because when the internal right to self-determination subject to the civil and political rights is mentioned, there is a definition of the territory. So we need to define the territory of Kashmir. Does the territory of Kashmir belong to India or not? If we insist on UPR of India, and if we put Kashmir in the UPR of India, then we legalize the legal thesis of India and say that this territory belongs to India. Now, there's an international wrongful act of the United Nations Security Council. There's an international wrongful act of the United Nations, and there is the international wrongful act of all of us, in fact. Let's remember, if we define that the problem of the Kashmir problem is an unfinished decolonization process. We have to go to back, and this is why till this time the Kashmir issue is blocked. And this is why, in fact, the human rights defenders in the legal sense act in a wrong manner of the wording of the self-determination subject to the Article 3 of the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. This is how India had changed Article 370 and Article 35A. And if we do not define the problem of Jammu and Kashmir as a non-finished decolonization process, all the people here, we legalize the legal thesis of Indian government. Now, we have to define one thing, what has happened? And how we can define also Pakistan as well, and India. They are administrative states subject to Chapter 11 of the UN Charter. Let's remember, when we say the Indian Independence Act of 1947, with, on the decolonization process, and the instrument of accession that was signed by the princely states, they are subject to Article 73, or in fact, Chapter 11 of the UN Charter. And we have to remember one thing, there's a misunderstanding of the wording of self-determination. It becomes a dirty word, in fact, in the international politics. The wording of self-determination in the UN Charter has nothing to do on independence and decolonization. And the wording of the self-determination in the civil and in the Convention on the Civil and Political Rights for the internal right to self-determination. But when we are talking about an unfinished decolonization process, it is something different than all the independence movements. The instrument of accession, the legal status of India is that the instrument of accession that the Maharaja has signed in the name of Jammu and Kashmir is a legal and binding decolonization agreement. And this is why the territory of India belongs to the territory of Jammu and Kashmir belongs to India. But this is not accepted by the United Nations Security Council. The reason is that in the UN Security Council debates in 1940s, there's also the problem of Junadak. Junadak is the vice versa position of India, where the Maharaja signed the instrument of accession was a Muslim, and the most population, like the 80% were Hindu, vice versa position of Jammu and Kashmir. And what India said, it is not the instrument of accession is valid in the case of the verdict of the people, and the instrument of accession of Junadak that was signed, and the accession of Junadak to Pakistan was not accepted in India. And they organized a self-determination referendum, and they said that this is the valid one. And there's an international principle of law. This is maxima legis contraria non est ordinances in Latin. You cannot say hot to something and call for the same thing in another thing. So when India said that Junadak, the instrument of accession of Junadak to Pakistan is not valid, they accepted that. The instrument of accession of the Maharaja of Kashmir is not valid as well. And this is how the UN Security Council did not accept the instrument of accession and ask for the self-determination referendum. This is the important point. When the United Nations Security Council asked for a new self-determination referendum, the United Nations Security Council nullified all the legal theses of India. And when asked a self-determination referendum, it means that the decolonization process of Jammu and Kashmir is unfinished. When the decolonization of the process is unfinished, subject to the realization of the self-determination referendum, then we need to define Pakistan and India. They are administrative states subject to UN Charter, Chapter 11. And when they are the administrative states, they've got the same responsibility as a colonial state subject to the UN Charter. There's an international wrongful act of the United Nations Security Council. We have to say this first. Because when they ask for a self-determination referendum realization, they define India and Pakistan as colonial administrative states, but in their UN Security Council resolutions, they did not ask the implementation of Article 73 of the UN Charter, Paragraph B, Paragraph A, which means that India and Pakistan should give yearly information for the Secretary General. And when you define an administrative state, the place of Jammu and Kashmir is not subject to the Universal Periodic Review, but subject to the New York Decolonization Committee of 24. And we have to understand, how can I say one thing? At the time of the UN Security Council had taken the decision on its resolutions for the self-determination referendum, the concept of decolonization was not understood as of today, and the case of no case of decolonization had come to the International Court of Justice. But as of today, with the decisions of or advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice on decolonization in different cases, like Western Sahara, like the occupied territory of Palestine, and the East Timor, decolonization accepted as a jus cogens norm. And it gives an erga omnes responsibility for all of the world. So it means that in the hierarchy of the laws, the realization of the decolonization is higher than every law, and every state has the same responsibility as India and Pakistan for the realization of this self-determination referendum. And
Thank you.
as of today, any state can take the case of Kashmir to the International Court of Justice, as it has got a right to do so with the past advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice. And I would like to say one more thing. What has been done is that there is an omission of the UN Security Council, and with the position of the International Court of Justice when defined erga omnes and jus cogens norm, one thing also happened. At the time of the UN Security Council resolutions accepted, the resolutions were not binding for India and Pakistan. It's accepted as an advisory opinion of the UN Security Council. But as of today, with the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, it says that it goes to the past before, in the case of the UK against norms. Now the resolutions of the UN Security Council moved to Chapter 7, and it has got a binding character. And this is our mistake, not to mention that the case is a case of decolonization committee. There's an omission of the UN Security Council, and India and Pakistan should give yearly report to the Secretary General of the United Nations, subject to Article 73, paragraph E of the UN Charter. And if you do not say this so, any future realization of a so-called self-determination referendum, we will come to the point, who has got a right to vote? If we take it as a decolonization case, who has got a right to vote is the descendants of the people who are who were living in Jammu and Kashmir before 1947. But if you say that it is subject to the Universal Periodic Review, any realization of the future self-determination, a so-called self-determination referendum, will be subject to all of the people, and it will be the realization of the settler colonialism of India in a way or other. So I thank you, dear Mr. Wadi.
Thank you, Mohammed Sukdol Guzel, for your intervention. Always a very learning one. I'll straight away go to Ms. Shani Ahmed. She has been there for a long time. She was the first to join. So Shani, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much indeed. Esselamun Aleyküm ve Rahmetullahum Berekatuhum. Hello, my friends. Merhabalar. Ehlen ve sehlen. Hi from Cairo for time being. First of all, before I begin with my remarks, dear friend Mary Scully, you just said that you received a child abduction alert. So if you find that suitable to share with everyone, every participant, and if you can do anything to help about, please do let us know. Going back to our topic, well, despite our previously highlighted invaluable points, I'm thanking to every participant in that. The National Human Rights Commission in India stated that there was no anti-convention law in India and everyone was free to practice their religion and beliefs. Furthermore, intercommunal violence was being dealt with by law and enforcement agencies. This is what they said. Of course, despite the rosy declaration of the National Human Rights Commission of India, the question still remains strongly with a particular point about India's Armed Forces Special Powers Act, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is widely occupying some articles of the country's Public Safety Act. And the contradicting practices executed on the grounds of these acts still do remain. Especially when all compared with the international human rights law, Universal Declaration of Human Rights articles, which are adopted by the United Nations, hence the United Nations member state India. Particularly today, when the ongoing human rights abuses comes to light in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir again and again and again. Of course, the National Human Rights Commission in India confidently continues to state that efforts must be made by the authorities to work along with the civil society. Then accordingly, of course, the civil society of the world do swiftly follow with their own guiding statements, declarations, findings, and suggestions about the past and current human rights abuses in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. With everybody's meeting around the same demand from the United Nations Security Council that it is about the time to act. It is about the time to act. United Nations Security Council members hear that. For example, when the Kashmir Institute of International Relations recommended that the Indian government to comply to the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, the Christian Solidarity Worldwide as well pointed to a recommendation about issuing standing invitation from India to all UN special procedures. In fact, now more than 20 globally acclaimed NGOs, associations, organizations, and unities, this including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, basically all the concerned stakeholders, with numerous invitations and recommendations, have approached India with a demand to improve her human rights record and to put an end to human rights abuses which are still being witnessed under her responsibility in occupied territory of Jammu and Kashmir. In addition to all with the research done by Arete Academy in Geneva, there is an invaluable report perfectly explained and proved the facts about Indian atrocities and violation of human rights. Indeed, these facts in the report are collected from the authentic sources, this including UN Office database. Yet, according to this report, the status of the human rights was revived by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in May 2017 for periodic review, and India has received 250 recommendations as well as 152 supported recommendations pointing about human rights violations within her region. Some was also particularly pointing to Jammu and Kashmir as well as to India as a key concern in the region, especially after the states repealing the Article 370, with a raising concern about the deteriorating human rights in the area. But despite all the calls, Indian authorities have failed to uphold their responsibilities in the areas of concern, and unfortunately, there is no radical progress has been achieved yet for securing human rights of the vulnerable citizens in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir or elsewhere in India. Now, the question once more is, despite all this local and global participation and efforts, why the current administration of India is still getting away with the ongoing human rights abuses in Jammu and Kashmir and elsewhere within her borders? Could this be the reason of favoritism led by some state, non-state, local and international decision makers, hence supported with some of the inconsistent and mismatching articles of the local, national and international law? Surely the above contributing factors do add to some democratically leading UN member countries' prioritized agendas with a particular concern for their trade, military, strategic settlement programs around the world, which happens to be keeping a desirable synchrony with India's beneficial support in many crucial regions and areas. But when it comes to law and human rights, we go back to same paradox while asking to the very United Nations members and to United Nations Security Council once more again to persuade India towards reshaping her policies and to coordinate them with the articles of the international human rights law. Otherwise, this will mean nothing but talk of talk. On the other hand, it is also the responsibility of the Indian and Pakistani authorities to establish a better collaboration, which supported with a time-sensitive and strictly controlled program, and to work together towards resolving this disagreement about the reality in Kashmir region. Because having further conflict in this world's most militarized zone and having two nuclear powers keep clashing about it would be more damaging for the world members and humanity, with no agenda left to protect for some colonials and colonialist calculations anyway. Besides, this is why the region of Kashmir should be taken more compassionately by the leading United Nations member countries and the United Nations Security Council itself. Surely and immediately we appreciate that all the previously mentioned and globally acknowledged NGOs, associations, organizations, institutions, groups, and decision-making bodies eventually agreed on this reality. Thank you for that. But now it is time to take the next step for these unities and to gather under one solid umbrella with a jointly selected administrative body. That's the thing we need to do at the moment. With a solid program and goal towards making sure that United Nations Security Council will take the next step and will put an end to human suffering in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and elsewhere they can reach.
Thank you.
After all, the right of people's self-determination is a basic principle in international law which is well protected by the United Nations. So the United Nations Security Council should consider to authorize the ICC, International Criminal Court, towards investigating some culprits who are clearly abusing the rights of the citizens in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and elsewhere within the borders of India. Considering and in spite of everything, human rights should never be protected differently, depending on people, where they are, or depending on some United Nations member states' own political, economic, logistic, military, trade positions and preferences in the global arena. This is where we come to unite and to put our pressure together. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Shani. Thank you very much for your intervention. Because I'm sorry, Dr. Farzana Yaqub, Nasir Qadri, Advocate Parvez Shah, Saira Shah, and Cecile are waiting for a long time. But Professor Farhan Mujahid Chak has to take class after this. So I will straight away go to Professor Farhan Mujahid Chak.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Wani. It's always a pleasure to support you in anything that you do. The Kashmir Institute of International Relations is a fantastic organization. It's a very busy organization. So I do apologize for my having to leave quickly. I have class actually in about 20 minutes. So I need to wrap things up and go to my lecture at the uni. But I'd like to start by saying that I completely concur with Hojam, Professor Mehmet's suggestions that we need to reframe very carefully, very judiciously, we need to reframe how we have traditionally canvassed for or put Kashmir in the international arena. We have to think very carefully of what Professor Mehmet had said. I've always been a proponent of this, and just his forceful and eloquent presentation today in which he said the Universal Periodic Review deals with human rights violations inside countries, and just by virtue of that, we are giving legitimacy to the Indian narrative that presupposes Kashmir as a part of India. Now, we reject that entire frame, and we need to be cautious of how inadvertently, for so long, so much of what we've been doing has not been really suiting the best interests of the people of Kashmir, nor of Pakistan for that matter, or global peace, if we wish to include it in a macro level scale. We need to carefully think on how we need to reposition Kashmir as a decolonial movement. We need to emphasize this in every academic, every foreign NGO, wherever we go, we need to emphasize this and kind of familiarize people with the history of occupation that began in 1846. And just to kind of put this, Dr. Mridu Rai has written a fantastic book that singularly deals with how the Dogras attempted, and I quote, a Hindu Rashtra in an overwhelmingly majority area. This is not a Kashmiri saying this is not a Pakistani, this is Indian origin academic acknowledging the role that the Dogra had in trying to Hinduanize, changing names, inventing history, usurping Buddhist monuments and claiming that they're Hindu. So there's a long process that's been going on, and it accelerated and began really in 1846 onwards. So how we frame it is fundamental, and I would hope that from now on, we don't inadvertently frame our discussion in a way that gives credence. This is not a human rights issue. Those human rights issues are the side to a political struggle of self-determination of a people that are not Indian, that do not want to be a part of the Indian Union, and that have been forced to do so through the barrel of a gun. Now, so in addition, I'd like to mention something very critical that's happened recently. As you all know, that in the Gulf, the entire Gulf region, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, the entire region, you have seen this revival and this kind of pushback against Indian policy within their country and in the disputed territory of Kashmir. You see how I even speak of it is very specific. I choose my words carefully, that they're two separate. It's not just in India, it's also in Kashmir. So what was happened recently is that there's been lots of local people that have been infuriated by what's happening inside with the minorities within India and what's happening with the majority inside occupied Kashmir. A thing that just happened recently that's been all over the news now is that 8 Indian retired naval officers that were working inside Qatar have been arrested and charged with espionage for sharing secrets of all places with Israel, and there is some allegation also with the UAE. But what's been released officially has been that they've been sharing secrets with Israel. Now, what we can do is raise awareness of the type of, let's say, camaraderie that exists between Hindutva fascism and Israeli fascism in the form of Zionism. We need to highlight fascism and its relationship, its camaraderie with one another. And that's another frame that we can highlight, that whether that exists in the form of radical right-wing extremists in the US, whether that is radical right-wing extremism in India, or wherever it manifests itself in Europe or elsewhere, they are in cahoots with one another. And this recent arrest is clearly, I think, is evident of that. So those are the 2 comments I'd like to make, that we need to really carefully understand how we're framing it, how we have been, and we need to do some soul searching in this regard to kind of change the narrative and the discourse. So thank you everyone for patiently listening and for participating regularly as you all do. I admire the work that you're all doing. Thank you very much, and look forward to continuing our collaboration in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Mujahid Sheikh. I will straight away go to Cecilia, to Iceland. Cecilia, you have the floor. You're there?
I am. I'm happy to go after the next speaker. I'm trying to get to somewhere that's a bit less noisy. So feel free to take someone next.
Okay. Let's say Nasir Qadri Sahab. You have the floor. Advocate Nasir Qadri, you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Wani Sahab. First of all, I'm grateful being a panelist, and that too, this is a very crucial issue. We have heard so far the theoretical side of this UPRs and India's positioning. But let me just share some pragmatic side of the story, particularly about the India and the UPRs. If we look the first cycle in 2008, then second cycle in 2012, and the third cycle in 2017, and then now the recent cycle, which is, of course, 2022, the 4th cycle of UPRs, there were some recommendations, and the recommendations from the NHRC, recommendations from the stakeholders. There are some issues which are of the dire importance. Other panelists, they have already discussed that, but let me tell you, there are some heinous crime against humanities which India has already been perpetrating in the northeastern side and of course in the occupied territory. And then there are so many observations from the Supreme Court as well. Supreme Court of India, right from the first cycle, the torture, Convention Against Torture, there were so many recommendations. The National Human Rights Commission, they also recommended to India to ratify the Convention Against the Torture, because torture is one of the heinous atrocity crime, and it is, of course, a crime against the humanity. Not only the torture, India is willfully staying away from the ratifying the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. Now, India has willfully stayed away from these two important conventions because India will be exposed of their crimes against humanity in occupied territory and in the northeastern side, where India is scooping the armed conflict against the Naxalites. If I share with you some of the judgments which were passed by the Indian Supreme Court, right from the Montedio versus State of Goa, it was about Indian judiciary vehemently failing to have the domestic legislation to stop the crimes against humanity. And then there is two important judgments. Please note and please analyze and see. It was Jagjit Singh Arora and Navjot Sandhu, where the court, they were reluctant in passing any orders because of the non-compliance, because of not having the domestic legislation. In Sandhu's case, Navjot Sandhu's case, court showed the failure of courts to consider and appreciate the qualitative different kinds of the armed conflicts. Then Kaitar Abbas Habib's case, again the failure, and the Salwa Judham case, where India vehemently failed to comply with the humanitarian law. I have seen the fourth UPR. There was, I really appreciate Altaf Hussain Wani Saab, who has recommended India of ratifying the additional protocol 1977 of Geneva Convention. But before that, has India ever complied the Geneva Convention? Because they have the domestic legislation as the Geneva Convention Act of 1960. No, the court has passed the conjectures. The court has multiple times issued the judgments wherein they said that there was non-compliance of the humanitarian laws in India. There's one case, Salwa Judham's case, where the Indian government of India officially they raised the armed militias, which was already raised in Kashmir. Armed militias disbanded the Supreme Court. And then, due to the non-compliance of this Geneva Convention, there was no prosecution. Now, not only this, the black laws, the draconian laws, already APSPA, Public Safety Act, and now this anti-terrorism law, so-called UAPA. There has been so much analysis on these. Even the Supreme Court has heavily burdened the state on the APSPA, but there is non-compliance. APSPA black laws are already there. Public Safety Act, which is to satisfy the subjective satisfaction of the detaining authority. Who is he? A third-rate judicial magistrate who passed the orders without applying the proper mind, without complying the constitutional mandate and the mandate under the UDHR, ICCPR. It's there. Everything is there. Every black law is there. Now this UAPA, which is stringent, a black law, detaining a renowned human rights defender, Khurram Parvez. There was no cogent evidence against Khurram Parvez, but there's an act, which the act says that any person can be declared as terrorist. Now, not only this, students, we have a case of a doctorate student who is languishing in jail from last 1 year, Ala Fazli. There's no charges against him. He was said in 2012, you wrote an article wherein you have challenged the so-called the sovereignty of India. India is no more a sovereign. India, if we analyze a practical on the pragmatic footing, keeping in view the judgments, the decrees passed by their own courts, the recommendations, the handicapness of the National Human Rights Commission, India, let us not shy away calling India as an apartheid state like the Israel. If Ukraine, if we see the issue of the Ukraine, the international community, they're just beating their chest out, calling that why Russia why we cannot issue a kind of order, or why there can't be a suspension of the Russia over the Russia's so-called invasion. One failed to understand the double standard of the international community. When the judicial orders are there, when the crime against humanity is documented, recorded, torture is recorded in India, a persecution of minority Muslims, my dear brother from the minority Sikh community was here. He has given his own testimony about his brother. Why can't we call India's apartheid state? And you know, there is already a provision in Article 6 and Article 5 of the UN Charter, suspension. Let us push India to those, expose to the extreme, expose all these atrocities, crime, what India has been perpetuating. There is a worse situation, if you remember, if we go recall whatever happened in Cambodia and Africa, when the international community, when they tried to suspend, though it was not there, you have seen there is an unfortunate case. I see as a student of law, international law, these states, they bully, particularly the superpowers. But there has always been a side of an oppressor because of the economic interest, because of so many other interests. But this is a time, you see all these UPR cycles, the recommendations, India is perpetrating, India is involved in war crimes, crime against humanity, now these non-compliance of these important treaties. So there a time has come where these cases and a global community, particularly civil societies, I'm happy that this KIR has invited so many intellectuals, so many activists from the different countries. A similar endeavor can be a physical endeavor to push for the tribunal, a criminal tribunal, where each of these atrocities, crimes, each of these non-complaints can be advocated. It can be discussed so that India should be held as an apartheid state. India is otherwise, their army is a rogue army because they are involved in the heinous crimes. Khurram Parvez, a human rights defender, has already exposed India of perpetrating the torture. They have named some officers who were the alleged perpetrators, who have committed the rape. 8,000 documented cases of the enforced disappearance are there. The courts are failing. Courts are run by RSS Sanghi, these the elevation of the Supreme Court and the High Court, particularly in the occupied territory. They all have the background of these RSS terrorists. So this is a time, come out of this framework, let this framework go. I disagree with the earlier panelists that we should not just focus. An occupying state who is occupying a territory, he has also the responsibility towards the occupants, the occupying. So India as an occupier has to fulfill the obligations because there are already laws of the occupation. Apart from let this process go, but there is always an alternative under the international law. I'll not take much time. This is another topic which would be discussed, how and what are the remedies under this international law to have the separate thing again is this apartheid state. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Advocate Nasir Qadri. Nasir Qadri has been doing a wonderful job in making the case law of the victims of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. I will go directly to Cecilia. Cecilia from Iceland, here with us from Iceland. Cecilia, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to check that you can hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant. Hi from Iceland, everyone. For those who might not know me, my name is Cecilia Jastremska, and I'm a senior policy advisor in UK government and chair of the International Network, which is a political think tank called the Fabian Society, though today I speak in a personal capacity. Thank you very much for having me today, Altaf and Dr. Professor Shagufta, and for all of your efforts in supporting the Kashmiri cause. And I have to say that it is extremely sobering to hear from those directly affected, such as Imtiaz and Gurpreet earlier. So thank you for sharing your stories. Today, I will focus on two elements of what I see the Indian government should answer for most clearly. The first of these, as mentioned in the UPR report, is the draconian Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is ostensibly meant to deal with secessionist violence, but which confers special powers on the Indian Army in disturbed areas and legitimizes any actions they may take. The problem with this is that army personnel acting under the AFSPA are immune from all actions taken under other laws of the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, and civil suits, unless otherwise sanctioned by the central government. Now, anyone with more than one brain cell analyzing this law, even before we look at how its effects have manifested, can see the glaringly obvious danger of abuse of authority when groups act with impunity instead of accountability. And over the years, unsurprisingly, there have been several voices of protest against this. There's the 11-year-long fast of Iram Sharmila, a Manipur activist demanding a repeal of the law. In 2004, civil society groups in Manipur launched an intense agitation after the death of Manorama Devi, a civilian while in the custody of the Assam Rifles. In 2005, following her death, the then Union Home Minister visited Manipur and instituted a commission under Justice Jeevan Reddy, which also asked for the modification or repeal of the AFSPA. In 2011, the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Omar Abdullah, too asked for the AFSPA to be lifted from the state. And in March this year, organizations both nationally and internationally have also jumped into the fray, asking for the repeal of the AFSPA in the Northeast and Jammu and Kashmir. And finally, of course, Christoph Hens, UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary or arbitrary execution, said, the AFSPA was described clearly as draconian and hated, and that it violates international law. And here I have to partially agree with Imtiaz and also Mary on the fact that comments and recommendations are all well and good, and they are an important part of the political process, I will note, but they do mean less than nothing when there is no weight behind them. As Mary rightly pointed out, so many countries are inextricably intertwined with India economically, politically, and otherwise, that they are so hesitant to substantiate their disingenuous words, which is in effect deliberate duplicity. This very much reminds me of developed countries promising to talk about loss and damages for the effects of climate change that developing countries inevitably bear the brunt of. Just as the Indian government notes the recommendation of the international community, there are lots of disingenuous platitudes spoken, but absolutely no actual implementation. The second element I wanted to zoom in on is the deceit with which the government wields, like a shield, the contrast between publicly spoken words and the reality that actually rears its ugly head. For example, on August the 5th in 2019, the Indian government promised security and reform and revoked the constitutional autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir and split the state into two federally governed territories. But what they actually did was to arbitrarily detain hundreds of people, implement a total communications blackout, and severely restrict freedom of movement and peaceful assembly, which is a bastion of democracy, the right to protest. The Indian government promised stability, but since 2019, the security forces have been implicated in numerous abuses, including routine harassment, ill treatment at checkpoints, arbitrary detention, and extrajudicial killings. The Indian government promised peace, while its militants killed at least 118 civilians, including 21 people from minority Hindu and Sikh communities. The Indian government promised equality, while its militants raped thousands of women and used them as tools of war, as aforementioned. I quote Meenakshi Ganguly, who is the South Asia director at Human Rights Watch. 3 years after the government revoked Jammu and Kashmir's constitutional status, the Indian authorities appeared to be more concerned with projecting an image of normalcy than ensuring rights and accountability. And I couldn't agree more. With 187 civil rights societies raising concerns, Amnesty International, the United Nations, multitudinous individual countries expressing outrage against atrocities committed and internationally codified human rights violations, you know that the reality of this is nothing short of harrowing. The only way forward, as several other panelists that I concur with have expressed, is sanctions. It's time to end the pretty words. It's time to stop commenting and recommending until we're all blue in the face. We have to pressure our own governments, as I have done with various other different international problems. For example, the Beirut blast, I pressured my government as part of my think tank to give aid to Lebanon, and it worked. We need to pressure our own governments. We need to join forces with as many activists as possible. Awareness is the biggest and most powerful weapon, because the hardest enemy to beat is an invisible one. And whilst obviously these reports are brilliant and the data is there, the proof is there, the evidence is there, we need to take it one step further. And that means pressure to mean sanctions. Because without sanctions, as we all know, India just will keep ignoring everything that we say, because it can. That's the simple and brutal truth of it. There was a question in the chat earlier about, is the economy more important than atrocities against humans? And the brutal truth is, to governments, to people like Modi, yes, it is. Because, and to other governments who are colluding with Modi, who are selling them arms or are in some sort of economic exchange with them, yes, money is going to be more important, and they will turn a blind eye, just as the UK government turns a blind eye on Saudi Arabia's massive human rights violations whilst we sell them weaponry. That is the reality of the world. So only sanctions are going to change that. So only pressuring our own governments, showing them these reports and asking them with being absolutely crystal clear that all of these recommendations at the end of the report be implemented, and that and to show essentially solidarity in the fact that we will not stand for it anymore. Because in 2022, it really is quite shocking when you read a report like that and you think that India is still classed as a democracy. Not to me, and not to many of the other panelists here, I assume. So thank you very much for having me, Altaf, Dr. Professor Shagufta. Thank you for all of your efforts. And as always, please let me know if there's anything more that I can do to help. And I will be sending this report round to my think tank and to the ministers that I know in UK government. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's true that ultimately it is the sanctions that can work. And that's why we are creating so much of awareness around the globe in order to make the governments know that human rights come first, economy comes last. You have to give value to the human rights. You have to give the value to the charter. So with this, I thank you, Ms. Cecilia. I will go to Farzana Yaqub, former Minister of AJK. She is with us this long. Farzana Yaqub, Saiba, do you hear me?
Ji, Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
Thank you so much, KIR and Altaf Wani Saab. Extremely important conversation for a lot of people. You know, the importance or significance of the processes within the United Nations. People don't understand them. And since they don't understand them, so we seldom realize or acknowledge that, you know, if we maintain our stance and empower ourselves by understanding how United Nations works, what are the different processes and what are the kind of interventions that we can take part in, we will not be able to push the agenda that we are all interested in, that is having a free and fair plebiscite in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. We also recognize and acknowledge the fact that nothing has really changed, no matter how much who has said and what kind of reports have been shared by different INGOs. The world does not seem to be ready to accept that India which is a growing giant and has its trade partners will not take any step to stop India from the abuses that it is putting, or the kind of abusive actions that India is doing on not just Kashmiris, but on the minorities that reside within other places in India as well. So what can we do? There's been in-depth conversation about UPR. There has also been in-depth conversation about how many people are incarcerated, what kind of numbers, what are the recent human rights abuses, people are being apprehended, but without any cause, without any judicial processes being followed. So what do we do? From henceforth, what is it that we take forward from this conversation that has been curated by Altaf Wani and everyone else? What I would suggest is that the least that we can do is that we start writing articles on these reports. These reports are extremely important. They need to be shared. We need to be more vocal about these reports. We should have more conversations, more conferences, and more people should discuss these reports. What happens and how these reports helps us is that we start using the right kind of vocabulary. Let's go back to 5th August 2019. Post 5th August 2019, what we saw was that a lot of articles were written about Indian occupied Kashmir. And what that did was it gave momentum to this issue. There were so many people, even today, although this is such an old issue, but we still find that people don't really know what is going on in Kashmir. People do not know what conflict of Kashmir is all about. And so when people started writing, and credit mostly goes to the Kashmiri diaspora and the Kashmiri journalists and the people in media who took up this issue, and they started writing about it. They started showing documentaries about it, and they started having conversations about it. We have to keep this process going on. The expectation that something will change, or that India, being an acknowledged rogue state, will suddenly listen to United Nations or anyone else, I don't think so. We can believe that this is possible. No, India will not. India is currently threatening that Azad Jammu Kashmir is also a part of India, and that is the next step that they will be taking. They are very clearly and very openly, overtly threatening different stances. The government, current Indian government is saying that it will take, it believes in Greater India, and so it will take back all the geographical territory that belongs to Greater India. When they say the word Akhand Bharat, what they mean is Greater India. And if we were to look at the geographical territory that defines Akhand Bharat, there is a lot of that territory which is still not part of India. And so they will move on. This is the same kind of mentality, the thought process and the activities that we have clearly seen in history in the time of Adolf Hitler. Germany believed that they were better, and they were working towards a greater Germany. And look at the number of people that were massacred, that were killed and murdered, and the way the whole situation progressed. It is the same that is happening in Kashmir. Muslims are being killed. A genocide has been going on. Recently, just this few days ago, it was the Jammu massacre day. More than 200,000 people were murdered on that one day. Now, it's just one massacre that took place. There is Poonch massacre. There are more massacres. There are hundreds and thousands of people that have been already killed. If we're playing a number game of people being murdered by the Indian army, I think we have come a long way. Do we really need to reach the millions of that to be considered important enough? Do we really need to reach the level of atrocities that Jews faced in Germany for the world to the global conscious to wake up and then to come forward? Or shall all of this happen just like it happened to the Jews? Once they were murdered, once they reached millions of people murdered and kicked out of Germany into a new territory, it was only then that the world decided to recognize this issue. Are we waiting for the same time? Kashmiris are leaving Kashmir. All those who can, not all of them. It is not possible for most of them to leave Kashmir, but the ones who are able to, they are leaving Kashmir. So many Kashmiris have moved to Turkey, to other countries, because it is almost impossible for them to live in the occupied territories. So what is it that can shake the global conscience for them to step forward and to bring a change that is required? At the moment, we don't see that. Post 5th August, so much happened, but none of the 5 countries who have the right to veto, except China, said anything about what India is doing. And then we look at the most recent crisis, which is Russia and Ukraine war. And the whole world has gone crazy. America in particular has taken a stance, and it is literally you're with America or you're against America. If we want wheat from Russia, there is no way we can buy it. Why? Because it will be considered that we are against the human conscience. We're going against America. Now, what is it that makes that conflict way more important than the conflict that we're suffering in? Why is it so important? And the language that is used, that, oh my God, this cannot be happening in Europe. Really, if it cannot happen in Europe, it shouldn't happen anywhere else as well. How come there are people who are of a better God, and then there are people like us who are of a lesser God or a smaller kind of people? So there will have to be a change. Otherwise, to believe in a peaceful world, it is against our conscience. And also, it is really difficult to have conversations about such an old issue without recognizing that we need to add the conversation of how do we take this forward. One, the media that I've already spoken about. Second, lodging legal cases against perpetrators in international jurisdiction. Nasir did not mention it, or maybe I did not hear it, but one case has been lodged in UK by a firm called Stoke White, and Nasir played a very instrumental role. I think that we should assist people like Advocate Nasir and others who are doing this great work. We should also be assisting people like Altaf Wani, who is working on documentation of the events, people who can make documentaries, people who can work on bringing people on board. This is the conversation that he has curated today. Hats off to him, because we have such different level and different kind of people that we seldom have when we're talking about Kashmir. So there's so much that we need to do. So I close this conversation with not a hopeless and a sad feeling, but I look forward to young people taking this conversation forward, young people doing better in representing this conflict. I hope and I believe that our next generation will be able to settle this conflict. And I really hope that, our people who are in the occupied territories will someday find the relief and peace that the world owes to them.
Thank you, Farzana Yaqub Saiba. I straight away go to Advocate Parvez Shah Saab. That's been waiting for a long time, looking great. Parvez Shah Saab, unfortunately, my battery of my gadget is also at the verge of end. So, floor is yours. Unmute yourself, Parvez Saab. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Wani Saab. Thank you, KIR. I was expecting that there will be some issue because most of the speakers have spoken, and anything left for me is to thank people. Anyway, I'm delighted that KIR has organized this webinar, and the people invited in this webinar are well versed and learned about the Kashmir situation. most of the panelists who spoke, I'm highly thankful to them on behalf of All Parties Hurriyat Conference, which represents the aspirations of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I thank Professor Mehmet, Mariana Zoka, Dr. Farhan Majid, Farzana Yaqub, my learned friend Nasir Qadri, Saab, who is doing a remarkable job on the legal front, Dr. Imtiaz, and Chelsea, who have made a wonderful intervention. And in addition to this, Sheena, Gurpreet Singh, and Maria. Anyway, thank you. Most of the panelists spoke in detail, and I will not take much of your time. I know you have a busy schedule. What I would like to say that we are talking at the time when Kashmir is going through the difficult phase of its history. There is a silence of the graveyard. No voices are coming out of Kashmir, and the news items are being smuggled. It has become a no-go area for NGOs and ONGOs. The fascist Modi government only allows pampered delegations to visit disputed territory to promote his false narrative, and Kashmiris are being barred from meeting these delegations. The corporate media of India is misleading international community and defacing Kashmiri's legitimate struggle for the right to self-determination. The pro-freedom leadership is in continuous detention, and most of them are seriously ill. Sayyid Ali Gilani died during decade-long house arrest. The most prominent leader, Muhammad Ashraf Sahrai and Altaf Ahmad Shah, were killed extrajudicially because no medicine or medical facilities were provided to them. The dead bodies are being buried by Indian forces, and their relatives and family members are not allowed to perform their rituals. Wani Sahab, as I talk of the situation, what is going on in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, at the same time, India is going through a security need at the United Nations, but unfortunately, most of the colleagues talked about the rosy national report submitted in pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution 5/1 and 1621. If we just go through the methodology, it is what it is mentioned. Accordingly, a draft of the report was prepared in collaboration with the National Law University after a series of consultations with diverse stakeholders, drawing representatives from judiciary, national human rights institutions, academicians, civil society members. But when if we just make some talk about the Kashmir and make some relevance with regarding to the Kashmir. In Kashmir, the State Human Rights Commission has already been closed, where the hundreds of cases were pending and subject to investigation. And at the same time, as most of the friends mentioned, the only man who was documenting the atrocities and human rights violations, Dr. Khurram Parvez, he is in detention. And one more colleague who was often on going to different courts and challenging the detentions of the people, and Untu, his name is Ahsan Untu Saab, he's also in detention. One fails to understand whom they have consulted while preparing this report. Kashmir has been completely neglected, and I say with assurance, and nobody, neither the lawyers nor the members of the civil society, not even individuals were consulted while preparing the draft report by the Government of India. We have just, if we see the previous pledge made by India at the United Nations and the recommendations made by different NGOs and states, the promises were made by India before the Human Rights Council that they will implement these recommendations, but we have seen that India even did not touch these recommendations and just threw them in a dustbin. It is a serious matter for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. We have witnessed the fate of previous UPRs. India made commitments and pledges to international community to bring its laws up to the international standards, but instead of abolishing these draconian laws, applied more stringent laws, especially in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. I'm talking of UPA, as Nasir Qadri was just has spoke at length about this law. And if we have just a glance, what this law is, that it leaves the detainees at the mercy of the executive, because whenever a person approaches the court, they do not give him any relief until and unless they get the nod from the executive. And at the same time, we have seen that about the Public Safety Act, India made the commitments in the previous UPR, but this law is settled here. We also remember that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in his 2 reports submitted to Human Rights Council, asked India to repeal this Public Safety Act, but this law is settled here, and more people are being detained and kept behind the bars. If we make just see the Indian commitments, I will touch only one thing, that is this Convention Against Torture. This Nasir Qadri Saab has